Just wanted to provide a quick update here on some of our ongoing federal and provincial FOIA requests, Freedom of Information requests, most of which have to do with COVID-19 and how the government handled that. This update here is on the provincial level here in Ontario. I put in a request back in February to determine whether the Ontario government did any sort of cost-benefit analysis when imposing non-medical interventions to help stop the spread of COVID-19. So this is things like masks and lockdowns, so on and so forth. So the question is ultimately, government, what data or what process did you go through to determine that this would be a better option to lock everybody down? Than the potential damages that would come with doing the lockdowns. Now, we hear a lot about economic damages by locking down. A lot of businesses, a lot of small businesses struggle, and a lot of times we hear that's just, the cost benefit analysis that people think about. But when we start talking about mental health, when we start talking about missed medical appointments, who we are as human beings, we need and desire connection with other people. All of these are massive costs that go along with things. And I ultimately wanted to know, has the government considered this? And I knew that there was some level of consideration that the government had done because they had put forth a few documents and a few studies from abroad suggesting that lockdowns might work. But note that most of those studies were done utilizing early day modeling that was wildly inaccurate, both with how fast things were spreading, but how severe the disease actually was. They basically had the vast majority of the modeling wrong and continued to have it wrong into 2021 and so forth. And keep in mind, in the early days of COVID, there were by April and May quite a few renowned scientists, doctors from around the world who were putting forth various studies of data from around the world saying, hey, we know what the infection fatality rate is. We know things aren't necessarily what you initially thought they were. This is a little bit more mild than we assumed. So, we don't really need lockdowns. We don't really need all these interventions. We just need focused protection. And that's what we saw through the Great Barrington Declaration. So with all this said, the idea here is that I wanted to know, did the government take into consideration all this stuff? If after the first 30, 40, 50 days, when you realize this thing was not that serious, why didn't they change their mind? Why did they continue going down this path of locking down for years to come? And so I submitted the request. I was, when you initially submit a request, you pay your $5 and you get usually a response within 30 days as to what's going to happen next. Now, what I got was, hey, we need an extension of about 60 days. Nowhere in there did they say, hey, the fees are going to increase or we need a lot of research hours for this. It was just a request, hey, we need a 60-day extension. So June 10th, which is just past a couple of days ago, I even said in a previous video, we were about to get all of our documents on June 10th. At the 11th hour, they sent me a message saying, this is to inform you that the time has been extended under Section 27 of the Act for an additional 60 days to August 9th, 2022. This extension is necessary in order to complete consultations which are required to comply with your requests. Relevant extracts of the Act are enclosed. Apologies for the delay in sending your information. We will endeavor to get your information before the full duration of this extension has elapsed, if possible. So immediately, I obviously wasn't happy with this decision, and ultimately what I can do here is file a complaint, basically asking someone to review whether or not this extension should be allowed or whether I should be able to get things expedited. If things still get locked up there, we could go to somewhat of a litigation type step where a third-party judge ultimately just orders what is going to happen next, whether it's a denial or the government has to produce something within a certain amount of days. I hope it doesn't get to that step. I don't really want it to get to that step. I'd rather this just be expedited much more quickly. But when I inquired, I don't really understand, because when you submit a request, the government had 90 days to produce this information, and they didn't produce that information. And what's very odd is typically when they're asking for time extensions, it's because they need to bring in more people. They need to bring in more hours of searching, which typically means the costs for the request go up. It costs $30 an hour for every search that needs to be done beyond the initial hours that are given to you in your initial application. We've talked about on this channel how some of our requests costs, close to $2,000, over $2,000, into the $3,000s of dollars when you're trying to get information, and there's tons of search hours that need to go in on behalf of the government and people involved. In this particular case, there was no interim fee. The guy I'm working with here told me right off the hop here, the fee didn't reach the threshold $100 or more where FIPA requires us to charge you an interim fee. So the next formal communication that you receive from us should be the final decision. So what he's essentially saying here is that in 90 days, they have not put more than 4 or 5 hours or so into this particular request, but now they're asking for another 60 days, and they're specifically asking for 60 more days based on consultations that they need to do. So this doesn't make sense to me. There's something weird about this particular situation, which is why I, went back to him and said, one other quick question. In my experience with FOIA, both at the federal and provincial level, typically time extensions coincide with increased search hours and a necessity for more manpower on the search. In this case, this second extension is being asked for under the necessity for consultations. Why couldn't these have been done months sooner? The search itself seems minor, such that an interim fee was not even necessary, so the delay is hard to understand. Any further insight would be helpful. So here I'm just asking, I don't get it. Why didn't you do any of these consultations in the first 90 days? And why are you saying that these consultations are now going to take another 60 days? To me, this situation feels a little bit like the government is trying to delay and put this off. There's obviously not a priority being put on determining whether or not a cost-benefit analysis has been done. If they had done a cost-benefit analysis that was reasonable, we probably would have got these documents very, very quickly, perhaps within 30 days or perhaps within a little bit more, but they're moving into consultations. I have not heard back from my latest question here, pushing back on why this wasn't done. I do expect to hear back. I don't know what kind of answer I'm going to get, but this is not a sort of normal process for FOIA in my experience so far. Again, this to me seems like they're trying to hold back something. And of course, this is very important. These documents are important because in this particular case, we're seeing that throughout the course of COVID, again, it would have been very forgivable if governments figured things out. Hey, we locked down for 30 days. We figured things out. Infection fatality rate isn't high. Maybe we don't need to lock down. Maybe we don't need all the masks. We understand more about COVID. And that happened, yet governments continued to lock down. So we're trying to understand why and how did governments make these decisions. Now, of course, a lot of people are going to think, well, of course they're not going to tell you. They don't have to tell you. Well, they're either going to give us the information and show us how they made their decisions, or they're going to utilize one of the existing exceptions, like, hey, this goes against national security, or to protect the government workers, we don't need to reveal this information, in which case that is a story within itself. So either way, we're going to get something from the government here with regards to them alluding to the public how transparent or not transparent they're going to be. If I had to assume, which I don't typically like to do, we're probably not going to get a whole lot in terms of them having a meaningful cost-benefit analysis. How did they determine whether or not these non-medical interventions were important? Did they consider mental health? Did they consider the children? Did they consider how their IQ would drop? Did they consider, the sheer and utter damage they would cause to people's mental health, to suicide rates, all these different things that we saw rise significantly throughout the course of COVID-19 with these non-medical interventions that we now know were not necessary, and that we probably knew back in April or May of 2020 that they were not necessary. So why did the government do this? Obviously, we have a lot of different perspectives that we can all throw in the comments, but at the end of the day, I wanted to give you guys an update, show you what's going on, help you understand what happens with these processes and how we're working to make this happen. Those who want to continue to donate to our particular requests here, the research hours, the time, the cost that goes into it, you can do so in the link below or in the first comment. And that's it. That's all. We'll have more updates as we learn more.